We've built technology to basically guide a business owner or an advisor to a business owner through a process to find out about their business, how it works, how it makes money, and capture the sort of key concepts around their business to get them a valuation.
Valuations are super expensive, and it's often the reason a lot of business owners don't really want to go there. But it's such an important thing to understand. And, I would encourage business owners to really start to explore this topic.
I was determined to help people understand that you can build a business of value and you can exit. It doesn't just have to be the sort of high profile stories that you hear in the news and the paper, the $1 billion exits and that. But for the average person with a business, how do you build a business that you can sell to somebody that can fund your retirement or next phase of life or whatever it is?
The goal with Exit Strategy is to create an educational platform that helps business owners and founders develop skills that will help them get their businesses sold. All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of Exit Strategy Secrets. Today we're going to be talking about a really interesting topic, valuation. For me personally, this has been something that I've had to learn and discover along the way. I think as an entrepreneur, I've always valued my business way higher than it actually was because I didn't really understand valuation properly. And in the last year, I've sort of dug into the topic quite deeply, started to understand more and more how important a business owner's knowledge of how to value their asset is when it comes to potentially selling their company or doing an M&A event. So today we've got an exit expert, a valuation expert with us, Graham from bizaval, who founded bizaval. And Graham's joining us today to share his insights. Welcome to the show, Graham.
Thanks, Aaron. Great to be here. I hope you're going to take it easy on me. It's quite a meaty topic, so just be
Yeah,
kind.
no, we're going to get stuck into it. We're going to get stuck into it. So Graham is a chartered accountant with 2 decades of experience in financial services, including years of involvement with startups and business development activities for large and small entities. With experience across several countries, Graham's biggest frustration is services that are too complicated and too expensive for entrepreneurs. Co-founding bizaval was a direct response to that friction in the market. When he isn't helping businesses address their challenges, Graham can be found on the racing simulator or planning his return to motorsport. So, Graham, what led you to specialize in business valuations?
Sure, Aaron, it's a long story. I think, you gave a bit of my background there. I spent sort of the first 10 years of my career in corporate, the next 10 year working for other people's startups. And the last 5 years, really, I've been firstly self-employed, and probably the last 2 years we've been on the bizaval journey. But it was really exactly that. Coming out of a corporate background, I was really, really frustrated around how so many business owners didn't have access to like professional services to help them understand the value of their business. And why this was such a big topic for me is my dad got made redundant in his early 40s, and he went on to become a solopreneur, self-employed. And the reality is, he didn't understand the concept of building a business or building a business of value. So now in his 70s, he's still working. He doesn't have a retirement nest egg. He hasn't been able to sell his business because he is the business. And initially, my frame of reference around entrepreneurship and business was that until I met my current business partner, where I sort of realized actually that this is about, it sounds like a bit like a rich dad, poor dad story, but where I came across a stat where 85% of small business owners never end up selling their businesses. My dad wasn't just the only one. Most businesses end up just being shut down or wound down. And I was determined to, go into this space to help change that, help people understand that you can build a business of value and you can exit. It doesn't just have to be the sort of high profile stories that you hear in the news and the paper, the $1 billion exits and that. But for the average person with a business, how do you build a business that you can sell to somebody that can fund your retirement or next phase of life or whatever it is?
Mm. Yeah, I think we're so aligned on that. And I've just noticed more and more how many business owners don't really understand the exit process. They don't have an exit strategy in place. They don't have much knowledge about the buyer market. And so that really is the purpose of this podcast. And yeah, I found out about you from listening to another podcast, to Scale Up with Nick Bradley, which I love. Um,
Correct. Yeah.
yeah, I really enjoyed the content that you shared there, and I thought it would be such a great idea to share this with our audience. We've recently partnered with Kaya Creative Studios, who are just helping us put this whole project together, making it seamless for us.
Partnering with Kaya really feels aligned to our mission and our integrity of our brand. They really do have a full array of podcast related services and products. The Kaya team have the experience, they have the insights, they have the understanding and the full medium to really help a brand kind of grow.
If you're listening to the show and you're interested in starting a podcast or making it part of your branding marketing strategy, you should get in touch with Kaya. It's an excellent service. Hope to make some amazing content out there. Maybe you can talk a little bit about bizaval and what it actually does as a platform, and how businesses can benefit from it.
Sure. So essentially, we do two things. We've developed an online platform that allows a business owner to value their business in anywhere between 30 and 45 minutes. So we've built technology to basically guide a business owner or an advisor to a business owner through a process to find out about their business, how it works, how it makes money, and capture the sort of key concepts around their business to get them a valuation, within 35 to 40 minutes. And it uses sort of investment banking grade back-end platforms, valuation methodologies. But what we've done is we simplified that so that a business owner can understand it. So we don't use complex terminology. You've experienced the process with some of your clients, Aaron. So, I think you got a good understanding of that. And then the second thing that we've built is a tool that allows you to assess your investor readiness or your exit readiness, if you want to call it that. So outside of value, what are the things that would make your business sellable or unsellable? And we'll cover some of those a little bit later in the episode. But that's effectively what bizaval's built, and we built it in such a way that it's affordable and accessible. So if you have to go to a typical big four audit firm, you could be paying north of 150,000 Rand for evaluation.
Yeah.
At our cheapest option, you can get that for just over 5,000 Rand. And if you want a little bit more of a human touch, we've also got options with that too. So, we can have the sit down and have the consultation and have all of that with you. And, but the idea was that we wanted to make it simple to understand, accurate, and affordable. And I think that's really what bizaval is all about.
Yeah, that's so interesting because valuations are super expensive, and it's often the reason a lot of business owners don't really want to go there, because they're like, I don't want to spend 40, 50K and go through this process. But it's such an important thing to understand. And I did a session yesterday with Stephen from bizaval and a friend of mine who owns a business. And it was so interesting to watch the process, because what I learned is that the business owner didn't really know, much about his financials, and didn't really understand the value drivers behind the business. He had actually no idea. This business has been running for 37 years, had
Yeah.
absolutely no idea what it was worth, and didn't really even grasp some of the key financial terms that, a buyer would want to know. So I found that quite interesting. And I would encourage business owners to really start to explore this topic. And maybe just to kick it off, you can start by educating, us around what are the primary valuation methods that people use to value a company.
So look, you can go and ask AI, and they'll probably come up with 100 different valuation methods. But effectively, I'll keep it really simple. Valuation is a function of risk and reward. Okay. And in very simple terms, is how much cash profit does a business generate now and into the future? And how risky is that cash profit? So that's the sort of fundamental departure point when you think about valuing a business. The second principle is one of willing buyer, willing seller. And now getting to the answer to your question is there's sort of three methods that we typically use. One is what we call the discounted cash flow approach, which basically, is the first method I explained, is what cash profits are you making now? What are you making in the future? Obviously, 100 Rand in 10 years' time is not worth 100 Rand today. It's worth a lot less. And then you apply what we call a discount rate or a required rate of return to those future profits, add it all up and get to a value in today's money. So that's typically what, private equity investors and, investment banking professionals will do. You might get fancy models and fancy ways of doing that, but at its core, that's a discounted cash flow. The second is what we call a multiples based approach or even a market based approach. And what that does is it looks at similar businesses to yours, industry, sector, region, and it typically tries to look at what their values are. And it says, "Hey, Aaron, you're a male of, let's call it, I don't even know your age, but let's call it 35 years old in Cape Town." Okay, and it compares you to other 35-year-old in Cape Town, and then says, "Okay, by definition, your business is worth X." So it compares you to other similar businesses. The danger with that approach, though, is that no two businesses are the same. So it's a good reference check. It's a good way to see, are you in the ballpark? And it's used quite often because it's an easy to understand measure. And then the third one is what the accountants typically use. It's called the net asset value measure. So if you look at your balance sheet, what are your assets? You add up all your property, your equipment, your stock, debtors, what they owe you, and you subtract from that what you owe other people. So any loans you might have, and that's your net asset value, the difference between your assets and your liabilities. Now, that method is typically used in the case of a liquidation scenario. It's a point in time measure. So, those are the three methods. We tend to focus on discounted cash flow, 70% of the time. Probably 20% of the time we'll look at things like earnings multiple methods. And net asset value is used sometimes when a business is in distress, it's not making profits, or it's in a liquidation scenario. You might go down that. So that's kind of a high level overview of the different ways of looking at valuing a business.
Yeah, yeah. Do you ever come across like sort of a revenue multiple in like a software scenario, or is that quite uncommon?
Yeah, so especially in the venture capital world, venture capital being early stage startup businesses
Mm,
and that, they'll refer to a revenue multiple. Now, a revenue multiple is a variant of an earnings multiple. And why do they use that? It says if your revenue is X, your business is worth, let's call it 4X, four times the revenue multiple. It's a proxy. So essentially, what it does, it says other software businesses like this that are earning X make so much profit and are worth so much. So again, it's an oversimplification. They use it in software businesses because often that requires scale and time to get to a point of profitability. So it is a measure that's used, but again, you've got to be very careful using revenue based methods. If you've got great revenue but no profit, your business isn't worth a lot. And the hypothesis behind a revenue based model is particular types of businesses typically would have certain profit margins. Okay. And if your business looks like those businesses with the same profit margins, by all means, a revenue multiple might be appropriate. But
mm.
it's too superficial, when you get to the nuts and bolts of things to apply that, without considering other factors.
So you've obviously done, I would imagine, thousands of valuations, right? Almost like a valuation brain surgeon. But I'm sure you've come across a few unique scenarios. What was the most surprising valuation that you've done, and what actually made it unique?
Aaron, when you sent me that question in preparation for this, I was like racking my brain to think, what's the most what's the most interesting valuation? But I had to think hard about this. I really enjoy the technology valuation. So we actually have a partnership with UCT where we look at some of their deep technology investments
Mm,
and trying to understand how a piece of IP or technology can become something of value. So I'm speaking generic terms, but I really kind of enjoy those kind of valuations because it really requires you to think about uh, what the future looks like, really dive deep into the kind of assumptions, the size of the market, and how this thing can eventually make money. So those are quite technical. One of the interesting ones we looked at there was a water technology business that effectively came about in the time of COVID. And what they do is they use it in hospitals to pick up disease traces in water. It's basically a special
Mm.
kind of tap. And we did a valuation on that kind of business. So that was super interesting. I'm trying to think, you know, I actually find the ones that are interesting are where the owners are interesting. And it might seem like a really, odd answer, but the principles for valuing any business are the same. And I think what really makes my job fun and interesting is the people that you meet along the way. At the end of the day, entrepreneurs are, they put their heart and soul into their businesses. And, we talk about that is a lot of this is about emotion. A lot of it is about like that passion that goes into it. So I'm answering your question in a very roundabout way.
I like it.
And it's the people that you meet along the way. I think that's more interesting for me than the actual what the business is. Why did they start the
Yeah.
business? What are their dreams? What do they want to do with it? That for me is what really makes this exciting.
Yeah, that is always interesting. Every business has its own story, and every owner has its own story. Yeah, I want to move on to value drivers in valuation, and there was kind of this like bombshell moment for me about 6 months ago when I was looking at my business and trying to understand, what's going to make it more valuable. And I came
Yeah.
across an article, and I read how a buyer will value recurring revenue much more than something that's not recurring. And I was like, wow, I don't have any recurring revenue in our business. It's a B2C model. We acquire customers, we grow it. And I didn't realize when I was building our business that recurring revenue would play such a big role in a valuation in the future. I probably would have built the business a little bit differently if I'd understood that. So,
Yeah.
you've obviously got insight into, things that drive up the value of a business and key levers that you can pull. So from your insight, what are those value drivers?
So I think I'll talk about a few. The first one is actually the biggest value driver is really simple. It's actually owner independence or owner dependence. So in other words, how easily is the business able to operate without the owner? So, we often ask the question when we do our valuation, like, what happens if you as a business owner take a 3 week holiday? It's like,
Mm,
well, I can go away for 3 weeks in the Karoo with no cell phone signal and all is good, through to, I can't take a 3 minute toilet break, or my business collapses. So, owner independence is probably one of the single biggest factors that we look at. And that kind of leads then to saying, well, have you built a business that's got systems and processes and redundancy that can scale with the business? The second one is the actual unit economics of the thing that you're selling or your business. And unit economics is basically how much money are you making for each sale that you do. So, there's a lot of technology businesses now which have been, we talk about online advertising and the cost of acquiring customers. They've got great revenue numbers, but, spending on AdWords and Google and that has just become so expensive that it's almost
mm,
more expensive to acquire a customer than what you're actually making off the product that you're selling online. So that's a practical example of sort of unit economics, but you want to kind of see how much profit does each widget make, and then how does that actually translate into cash profits? So, your unit economics, your margins are absolutely critical. I think a third one is your customer concentration. So, in other words, what percentage of your revenue comes from your three biggest customers, for argument's sake? So I've seen a lot of great businesses, great unit economics, and they've got one key customer. Maybe they're supplying a retailer or they've got a government contract, and that contract gets cut and the business is underwater before you can count to three. So diversification of your customer base and having multiple customers is another key thing that investors will look at. And the last one, well, I'll touch on two more things. The one is you've touched on already, and we talk about this annuity income or recurring revenue. You know, a lot of businesses every single month, you start from scratch. If you've got a restaurant, for instance, until somebody walks, yes, you get repeat customers. But if you've got a restaurant at the beginning of every month, you've got no revenue. You've got to have people coming through the door. Now, your
mm,
recurring revenue is how many repeat customers do you have? How many people do you coming back every month? So if you look at a business like Spotify or Netflix, that's an ideal recurring revenue model. You kind of sign a subscription and they get the money every single month. So that's something which is a huge impact on value. And then I think the last one to maybe touch on is, your growth rate. So evaluation is a function of now and into the future. So if your business is profitable, but it's not growing, that's not great either. So, for a business to have super high value, it's got to be able to grow and grow sustainably. And a lot of these sort of big tech startups and that, they look at those growth rates, they might not be profitable now, but they're growing rapidly. So if your business doesn't have a targeted growth strategy to continue growth into the future, that's a red flag. And investors will often look at that. What is the growth strategy? And how confident are they that you as the business owners will actually be able to execute on that? So, everyone hates a salesperson. I mean, I know you come out of a sales background. Salespeople often look at the guys who sell you stuff that you don't need. But I've come to believe that, without sales,
Mm.
a business doesn't exist. And that's why successful salespeople make so much money, because business owners realize how important that is to their business. So, there's probably 100 different things we could talk about, but for me, those are probably the five biggest things that I would focus on.
100%. I mean, I would add one more piece, which is, a proper financial system in your business. So I've noticed quite a lot with, owner run businesses that have been around for a while, not using proper accounting systems, maybe running some personal
Yeah,
expenses through the business, and not having a good, well structured last 3 years of financials and a budget for the future, and kind of
yeah,
operating a business as a kind of month to month lifestyle type of system. And I think that, if I was buying a business, and I have looked at a few businesses to buy, and the moment I see a messy financial system, I'm sort of like, it's a red flag, because I'm like, I can't really do a proper analysis on this because I don't understand, how this financial system works. So one of the things I would say, if somebody's thinking about like selling, get a proper, even a fractional CFO in, and start like cleaning up how your business
yeah.
operates month to month with, what do you think about that as well?
Aaron, I mean, you nailed it. So we talk about value drivers. So the ones I spoke about are the things that like really increase your value. And I
Yes.
guess, and then we talk about value detractors. And
All
so,
right.
so I kind of look at that from the other way around is, just having good books doesn't necessarily, create value. But if you don't have it, then it destroys value. So, and you're absolutely right. Investors will ask for your last 3 years financials. So, even before a fractional CFO, make sure you've got a damn good bookkeeper, that your base accounts are properly organized and all of those sorts of things. So that's absolutely critical. Also inconsistency, personal expenditure through a business is another thing. People do that because they're trying to pay less tax or whatever advice they get from their mate at the pub. Don't do that sort of stuff. You see businesses that I've seen businesses where the owner will say, listen, I've got an extra couple of million that is not on the books, so my business must be worth more. And my answer is, well, firstly, you've got to declare that to the tax authorities. Okay. And number two, your business isn't worth more because nobody's going to pay for that unless it's in the book. So record keeping, governance around that sort of stuff, absolutely crucial. I mean, I can't actually emphasize that enough. And I'll give one example of a client that we um, had good books and all of that sort of thing. The question of having your accounts audited. If you're serious about selling your business one day, and the size of your business is such that you want, I don't know, in South African rands, let's call it a 50 million rand business plus. It's worth thinking about having your accounts audited, because somebody who's going to buy into that business is probably going to insist on that at the stage of selling or due diligence on that business. So a lot of business owners say, well, I'm not going to get them audited. It's a couple of $100,000 a year to have that done. It's not worth it. But I've seen deals collapse because an audit hasn't been done historically. It then gets done at the time of the deal and something goes wrong. So those kind of things are, a lot of business owners don't know what they don't know. They're not malicious about not doing those things properly, but absolutely critical that you get it right.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I when I started sort of thinking about exiting, I hadn't done audited financials, and to be honest, I actually didn't even know what that really meant because I'm not an accountant.
Mm.
I focus on growing the business. I'm entrepreneurial. Like, for someone who doesn't really understand that, what does that even mean?
Yeah, so basically, an audit is you get a professional accountant, independent, who comes in, and they basically give assurance that what's in your financial statements reflects reality. Okay. That if you say you're making R1 million profit, you actually are making R1 million profit. That's essentially what an audit is. And you pay a third person to verify or validate that.
Okay.
So that's essentially, in a nutshell, in layman's terms.
Yeah, I know, because I know when we did our audit, they looked for receipts and invoices from things that had happened a year ago, a trip here or this and that, and we actually didn't have everything. We were
Yeah,
able to collect it over time. So I think, yeah, I mean, if you are preparing for an exit, even if it's in 2 years' time, set up this accounting systems with the right documents, the invoices, the slips, and everything, so that it's clean. It'll probably improve
yeah.
the speed of the deal when it comes down to the due diligence process. So yeah, I mean, I guess interesting question I wanted to ask you here is like, let's say, yeah, someone comes to you, they want to sell their business, and they're like, okay, well, if I had just 6 months and I want to increase the value of this asset, what advice would you give them?
So I want to just start that by saying often the first thing you need to do is just assess, is your business actually exit ready or sellable? A 6 month window for most businesses is an unrealistic time frame to think about selling a business. In most cases, we see it takes anywhere between 18 months to 24 months to get exit ready. And somebody coming to me, saying, I want to sell my business in 6 months and they're not ready. It'll be like you coming to me, Aaron, and saying, listen, I want to take part in the next Olympics, just get me ready. Okay. So, I'd love to
Yeah.
say, here's a couple of things that you can do. What I would do though, is I would make sure that you can't go, you know, people think I can go wave a magic wand and crook the books or do whatever, there's nothing you can do. What you can do though, is you can make sure that you get all your housekeeping in order, you get your accounting right in a 6 month period. You make sure that you actually have a growth strategy bedded down, and how you're going to grow the business in the next few years. So there are things that you can do to demonstrate that you're actually thinking about how you're going to grow the business. You can think about your succession. If you are running the business and doing everything day in and day out, do things like document those processes, start to train somebody else who's doing that. In a 6 month window, very unlikely that you're suddenly going to be able to go and kind of like put lipstick on a pig, so to speak. So I think a more realistic time frame is probably 18 months to get a business exit ready. And then you go through a checklist of all these different things we spoke around, your growth strategy, your cash conversion, what can you do to improve your recurring revenue? What can you do to reduce your owner dependence? And that's sort of this process that you need to go through. And there's nothing complicated about it. It just requires kind of a roadmap and requires you
Mm.
knowing what to do. Most business owners are incredibly smart. That's why they go into business in the first place. They're just ignorant of what makes, they know how to make money and how to survive, but they're ignorant of what makes that business attractive sometimes to another potential buyer. And that's the sort of coaching that needs to happen when you get your business exit ready, is what makes your business appealing to somebody
Yeah.
else to write a check for that.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And that's the whole point of this podcast, really, because, in my own experience, starting a business, growing a business, innovating, taking it
Mm,
global, I just never knew anything about an exit or how to strategize for an exit. So when I started thinking about it, I was like, wow, this is all new to me. And
yeah.
one of the goals of our project is to run a boot camp. We're going to run a boot camp,
Mm,
invite business owners, and we're going to have sessions that are very focused around, let's talk about, what does a sale actually entail? What are the different parts that it's
Mm.
like going to market with your business. You have to package it. You have to find buyers. You have to go through due diligence. You have to negotiate a sale. It's really important information to understand. And if you're going to have a capital event in your life, you want to maximize it and you want to make sure it actually happens. And I know we've been chatting about you running a valuation workshop with this group. If you had to
Yeah.
run that, how would you run it with a group of people, and what would the outcome be?
Well, look, I mean, these things typically are always best done one on one. But the beauty
Yeah.
of the tool and the way that we built this process is, we're going to do this in these boot camps, is we're going to have a workshop session. We're going to send the guys who are attending some information that they need to think about beforehand, so some basics around, their financial information, their growth plans, and what have you. And we're going to do it through the platform. Everyone will have their own logins. They'll go through the process of actually capturing the information. At the end of the process, they'll have an answer and a range of valuations for their business. And most importantly, they'll have the tools to run different scenarios and what if. So, what if they change the following thing? And that I didn't touch on that earlier, Aaron, but I think more than knowing the absolute value of your valuation, knowing how you can improve that and what changing different things does to that value, those sort of value drivers, is almost more critical. And that I think is kind of how we're going to run the process. And yeah, I really look forward to that workshop we're going to have.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of like aha moments, that arise as people go through it. And I think what I think is going to be super interesting is people looking at other people's businesses and going, how did you value your company and how did you value your company? I think business owners don't really talk to other business owners much about, valuation and value drivers, and let's actually work together to
Yeah.
grow the value of our companies. It can be quite an isolating journey without the right people around you. Um, and I find in South Africa specifically, the conversation around exits, around liquidity events, isn't quite as mature as it is in the US. And
Yeah.
hopefully we can improve people's prospects of getting to that point.
Yeah, I think it's about how do we kind of rise the tide for everyone. A lot of it's about education. I think in South Africa as well, you talk about the US. The US is geared towards entrepreneurs. They've got things like what you call the SBA. It's called the Small Business Acquisition Loan Scheme. So if you want to buy a business, the banks will put up money for you to buy a business. You don't have to put a lot of your own money down, and that's there's a lot of
Mm.
liquidity, as you say, in this market. In South Africa, it's a lot more tightly held. It's not easy to go and buy a small business, but I think the more conversations we have with business owners, people in the ecosystem, bringing people together, I think there really is an opportunity. South Africa's got, a flood of entrepreneurs. It's a very entrepreneurial country, but we don't necessarily have all the support structures to really support the valuation or the value creation process. And I think that's what we're trying to change. That's what you're trying to change through the exit boot camps and that. And, we just would love to be a part of that journey and excited to be part of that journey.
Yeah, so I'm actually interested, in your thoughts around this is, business that's making 2-3 million rand profit, growing. Who are the buyers of these businesses? Because obviously, private equity are looking for bigger businesses. It only makes sense for them to acquire a certain size of business. Venture capital are
Yeah.
looking for really high growing businesses. So, who's in the middle market that you've seen?
So a lot of this, there's a bunch of different buyers. So we based in Cape Town. I see a lot of people who've had good corporate jobs in Johannesburg, for instance, wanting to move down to a slow pace of life, and they're like, I want to go out of corporate, and they've got a nice payout, and they've got some money. They want to buy a business. I see a lot of that. Guys coming down saying, can you find me a business that's making 3 or 4 million rand a year profit? So we see some of that. We do see some sort of roll ups, what you call a roll up. It's private equity, but they're looking for, you know, 3 or 4 accounting practices that they can buy, put together, and then generate some scale. So there's a little bit of that, but not a huge amount. There tend to be sort of private investor groups that we have, 3 or 4 wealthy individuals
Mm.
with money and they look for, let's call it, cash generative businesses. There's a term for it. They call them boring businesses in the States. They're not
I love a
exciting, but they're sorry.
I was saying, I love a boring cash generative business.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's the dream. You kind of just let it tick over in the background. But, so it does tend to be sort of consortiums of private investors. But it is a real challenge because to get access to funding, we had actually a client of ours, I can't mention any names, but he was in the financial industry, a young guy. And he said, listen, he's an actuary, but he actually wants to do something different. And his neighbor
Mm.
happened to own, let me change the name, but he happened to own a retail store, let's call it that. 75 years old, wanting to retire, been in the business for 40 years, and got to know my client. And my client said, listen, I want to buy your business, but I don't have the means. Um, and this guy then struck a deal with him. He said, look, we can structure this on the basis of come work with me on a Saturday for 6 months, see if you like the business. Um, and he then kind of passed it down. He didn't have any children of his own that he could pass the business down to. And there was an arrangement where he paid him out of the profits of the business over the next 3 or 4 years. So I'm using that as an example, but that's one creative way that you could actually think about, transferring ownership. And in South Africa, that concept of an earnout happens quite a lot because there isn't a lot of capital available. And the earnout is where you say, I'll pay a portion up front for the business and I'll pay you the rest over the next 2 or 3 years. And that's one of the realities. When you've got lots of liquidity, you don't necessarily need to have as much of an earnout structure. In South Africa, we do see a lot of that where there's not a lot of capital upfront always for these kind of smaller businesses. And when I say smaller, I'm talking 20 to 60 million rand valuation businesses. Bigger than that, private equity and the guys start to get involved. Smaller than that, guys bond their house and buy a little restaurant kind of thing. So it's that sort
Yeah.
of neglected middle where there really is a challenge. And I think a lot of that's about visibility. It's about bringing people together, creating the ecosystem that people can, identify deals and deal flow, both from a buyer and a seller perspective. And I know that's something that you're also incredibly passionate about, Aaron, is kind of create that sort of marketplace to allow that. We at bizaval, we are independent. We do valuations. We don't buy and sell businesses. We do that intentionally because we don't want to kind of give you a view that says, oh, your business is X, so that we can land the sale mandate to sell your business and then inflate your valuation. So um, I think creating that ecosystem is critical. It's a challenge we've got in South Africa. And the more people that talk about it and become aware of it and get together and say, how do we create this environment that we can create investment opportunities, the better, I think.
Yeah, I also find what you're saying very interesting because I've started really looking into acquisition entrepreneurship as a form of entrepreneurship. So, obviously I
Mm,
started a business and, it takes a long time to start a business. You've got to, get funding, you've got to get product market fit, you've got to, um, hire a team and build. And it takes about 3 years to get off the ground. So
mm,
I've been thinking about, do I want to start another business? And I like building things. And then I realized, it's actually probably faster and less risky to potentially buy a business that's been around for 30 or 40 years or 20 years
mm,
that has a team, that has product market fit, that has customers, and then use my experience to ultimately grow the business. And so, I've been looking at businesses and I've been going through the valuation process. There's a couple of things I want to talk about here. But one of the things is financing. Like, how am I going to finance the purchase of a company? I found a couple of interesting ways. One of them is to partner with an investor and say, hey, look, I found a great business. Would you want to partner with me? I'll put a bit of money down. Maybe you'll loan me some and we'll purchase this asset. And this is how it'll grow. And this is how you'll get your return. So that's been actually interesting because I've found investors want to invest, that they don't want to operate.
mm,
So they are willing to, and they want to understand the value. And the value that I've been kind of really sort of leaning into with these businesses is sort of a 3 to 4x multiple on their EBITDA. which seems to
Yeah.
be comfortable for an investor who's going, okay, well, over 4 years or 3.5 years, this my our investment will be paid back,
Yeah.
essentially, which seems to be like a standard in this kind of middle market space. So I
Yeah. I think. I
found
think.
that
I think
pretty.
you. Sorry, I'm talking over you, Aaron. It's your podcast, but there's a term for that, and it's known as a search fund, effectively. In the States, that's quite a big concept. It's basically you back a young entrepreneur, whether he's got his MBA or whatever the case might be, to buy a business, and you match the investor with a young entrepreneur who's going to be an operator. And I think there's one or two guys who are doing that in South Africa, but it hasn't yet taken off its scale. And I think it is definitely a mechanism. And when you think of the South African context, right, you've got a lot of great young entrepreneurs across the spectrum, and what they need is investors. And what investors want is they want jockeys, so to speak, who've got skin in the game. They're hungry,
Mm.
they're ambitious, and all of those sorts of things. So if you can mix those two together, and look, you're right. You can't be naive about it as well. But I think that's a real opportunity in South African context.
Yeah, 100%. And then it's also it provides the owner with some sort of mechanism to have someone continue their legacy. So if you're a business owner, and your
Mm,
business is kind of you're not sure, like, can it exit? Who could I sell it to? That's an interesting option, is to find an operator and help them get an investor to take over your business. And then the other interesting thing I sort of came across was seller financing. So you create a deal with the owner where, essentially they step out of the business, they transfer ownership, but they sort of just get paid off. They loan, the business loans them, the money, and they get paid
yeah,
off over a period of time, with interest, or even potentially a kicker at the end if there's some upside. So that's an interesting way to, if you're an owner and you want to accelerate the process of getting a deal done, you could set up a seller financing type of scenario.
yeah. I think those are going to become more and more prominent. I mean, historically, um, seller finance is, again, I'll use the US as an example. It's prevalent over there. And I think, we need to adapt those kind of models for the South African context. You're operating in a much higher interest rate environment here. There's often a lot more risk involved. So, but I think we got to be creative around how we kind of support this ecosystem and create liquidity. That's what it's all about at the end of the day, is the more liquidity you can create and the more opportunities you can create for young entrepreneurs, is, I think, what's going to make the difference between this country having a thriving ecosystem of SMB businesses, and just kind of ticking along and having this old school model of 60-year-old men running their old engineering firms, and we've got to change that narrative.
I 100% agree with you. I think it starts with people talking about it. And
Yeah.
that kind of leads me into kind of the last piece of this podcast, which is, the emotional aspect of a business owner's kind of relating to value and relating to selling their business, which they've identified with for the last 20 or 30 years or 10 years. I'm sure you see a lot of that. And earlier you mentioned, the interesting part of your job is the people you meet. But I'm sure the even
Mm,
more interesting part of your job is, the emotional unfolding of this process. So maybe you can talk
yeah.
a little bit of your experience in this aspect of the business exit or the valuation.
Aaron, there's so many legs to this, but the first one, that emotional connection between a founder and their business, particularly somebody who's been in the business for a long time, okay, runs deep. And on two levels. One is, because somebody's emotionally involved, often they tend to overvalue what their
Mm.
business is worth to somebody else.
Happened to
It's a bit
me.
like, yeah, it's a bit like, if when you go to your grandmother's flat or her house, and you've had memories growing up in that place, and you're not going to sell your grand. It might be run down and dilapidated, but to you, that flat is worth a huge amount of money. it's almost priceless in some ways because of those memories that you might have. And it's the same with businesses. So they tend to overinflate the value. And then it's a bit of a come down when you're like, well, actually, like this is what somebody else is going to be prepared to pay for it. So that lime green bathroom and kitchen in that 70s home that you built, trying to sell it to a millennial who wants like a marble slate top and what have you is not going to work. The second emotional piece, and I've seen this a lot, is business owners come to say they want to sell, and you go through a process with them, you get them sale ready, they even find a buyer and pull out at the 11th hour because they just can't actually, they can't go through with it. I've seen that happen. We joke about that. So if you want to sell your business, you actually have to get emotionally ready to let go. Um, and often that's hard for business owners when sometimes there's what you call an earnout, right? So if you sell your business and the new buyer says, you're going to work for me for 3 years and I want you to do a handover and all those good things. And suddenly you've got a business owner who's used to calling the shots.
Mm.
Somebody else is now his boss, but he's got to stick around in the business for a few years and work in that business. And that seldom ends well because, what you've built is now owned by somebody else and you've got to create that separation. So those are just a couple of different aspects. And we see it, I mean, there's lots of deals in that space. Well, I think it was Yappy Chef that sold to Mr. Price. I mean, I'll use that as an example. And I think the owner stayed in the business for a couple of years afterwards, and then they left. And it's because it's a clash of cultures, and you're not the boss anymore. So the emotional aspect goes from overvaluing, not wanting to step out. When you sell the business, somebody else is taking over your legacy and doing things differently. And you've got to come to terms with all those different things. And then also, what are you going to do afterwards? So after you've sold your business, what's going to keep you busy? I've seen it. A lot of guys with big exits, where they make a lot of
Yeah.
money. After 6 months, they're bored. They've played all the golf they can. They've done all the afternoon siestas, and then they want to do something else. So I think entrepreneurs are often wired to do something else, and you've got to think about that. What are your real reasons for selling? Maybe
Mm.
it applies more to sort of the young entrepreneurs. If you're in your 60s and you actually genuinely want to retire, different story. But that is really, really important. Is what do you want to do next after you've sold? And not a lot of people talk about that. They think they're going to have the paycheck, and then afterwards they don't know where to go.
Yeah, that is an interesting concept. I mean, I like to talk about my own experience on this podcast because it's relevant. And a year ago, my idea was like, okay, I'm thinking about exiting in the future. I need to exit my role operationally, and we brought in a CEO to kind of run the business, Michael Hubert, who's been incredible and brought an immense amount of value. And we had a conversation, and he came in and he started running the business. And he did things differently to how I would have done them, and it was weird. It was interesting. I'm now in this culture, and I can't call the shots, but I wanted this, and it was a bit of a grappling. For about 3 months, I had to just sit back and go, okay, you emotionally need to relax and let this happen. This is important. And now it's been a year, and I've pretty much
Yeah.
almost fully exited operationally from the business. And Mike has kind of made the business more professional, from
Mm.
every aspect compared to how I would run it, which is very entrepreneurial. And it's amazing when you're able to steward someone else into a role and remove yourself out. And I think that's such an important aspect. Like you said right in the beginning, one of the value drivers is how dependent on the owner is this business. And my strength
Mm.
was sales. And that was actually
Yeah.
one of the weaknesses of the organization, because I was always, doing that. I realized if I took myself out, then that's going to be a weakness. So it's an interesting
Yeah.
thing to think about as an owner. Your strength becomes the organization's weakness, and that's something to identify
Absolutely.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
solve early, because that's going to be identified in the sale.
Yeah, I think that's such a profound point. Is your strength becomes the business's weakness, and that's the mental shift I think, which is very hard for a lot of people to make. But because then you start to question, well, what value am I adding? When you do that, and
Exactly.
and the value you're adding is that you're making. If you think about it, nobody wants to buy a difficult business to run. An investor wants to buy a business that makes money easily, consistently, and growing, right? So that's your job if you ever do want to exit a business, is to build the systems and the processes and the procedures that enables that.
Mm. So, Graham, I know you have another meeting in about 4 minutes. So I think it's a good time to wrap up. I guess I always like to try finish off on, what are the last few nuggets of wisdom that you can leave with the audience. And, this audience has obviously absorbed a lot of information in this session. And I guess, just to close it off, in your experience, people thinking about valuation, thinking about exit, what is the final thing that you can advise people as they go through this process with a little bit more knowledge?
So the thing I'd leave the listeners with is start today. Don't wait until you're ready to sell to start thinking about value. And even if you one day into your entrepreneurial journey, you started a new business yesterday, start with that goal of saying, how am I going to build a business of value? And that is absolutely critical, because you've got that mindset from day one. You're thinking about, how do I build those sales processes that aren't dependent on me? How do I get
Mm,
my
mm,
accounting records right from day one? It's a lot easier to get into that habit from the get go. And I'll use an analogy. I'll use a health analogy. If you're somebody who's been drinking and smoking and sitting on the couch your whole life, the chance, and you're 50 years old, it's a lot harder to stop those behaviors. If you start going to the gym and eating healthy and all of that when you're 16, by the time you get to 50, you're going to be fit and healthy. So, a business is a little bit like that. It's like, what you put in is what you're going to get out. And the sooner you start
mm,
those good behaviors and those good practices, the better. And just allied to that is, get yourself a coach or a guide, whether it's a fractional CFO, somebody else who's exited a business before, a business mentor, who can actually guide you and coach you through that process. Because as business owners and entrepreneurs, sometimes we get such tunnel vision that we don't take a
mm,
step back and kind of see it as somebody else would objectively. So that would be my last takeout: is
mm.
find somebody that can guide you along the journey, or just mentor you, or share their past stories. And I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think it's always a good idea to have a coach and a therapist. My girlfriend's always like, you got to get a therapist. But anyway, that's a whole different topic. But Graham, so lovely to have you on the show. Really, really enjoy your insights on this particular topic, and have really enjoyed getting to know you and working together. I think if anyone who's listening wants to do a business valuation, you can go into the bizaval website. You can probably contact Graham via LinkedIn, have a chat. I will leave his link in the show notes and the link to bizaval, and we'll talk more about the bootcamp and these exciting things coming up. But for now, thank you very much for listening, and Graham, have a great day. Appreciate it.
Fantastic, Aaron. You too, and watch the space. We've got great things that we're going to do together. So really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Graham. Cheers, everyone. Bye.